Welcome to the Legal Insurrection Podcast. Today is February 27th, and this is episode 24. My name is Kimberly Kay, and I'm the Editorial and Operations Director at the Legal Insurrection Foundation, and I'm here with our president and founder, Professor Jacobson. So let's go ahead and jump in. Quite a bit to talk about this week, as is the case with most weeks, especially during Trump's second term. We have so much happening in the court system now. And if you're just joining us or if you're new to our podcast, we talk a lot about the lawfare that Trump is facing, how Democrats tend to use the court system to halt Republican agendas and are doing so with Trump. And we have things happening, across the board. Trump's initiatives are being challenged. The USAID funding cuts are being challenged. We have a lot happening. So do you want to jump into that and tell us a little bit about what we're watching and what we're seeing there?
Yeah. So what we're seeing, unfortunately, is a number of federal district court judges stepping out of their lane into interfering with the executive branch. So not the normal type of judicial review that we're used to, where you opine on the legality of various actions. We are seeing a number of federal district court judges essentially running aspects of executive departments, telling the government, the executive department, who they can hire, who they can fire, who they can consult with, what records they can look at. And most outrageously, in something that just got to the Supreme Court, forcing or attempting to force the executive department, the Department of State, USAID, to pay $2 billion in invoices, 1,000 different invoices, apparently, that before the government even has a chance to verify if the money is owed. That was a judge in D.C. Totally outrageous, I dare say crazy ruling, which is unprecedented. That judge has no jurisdiction to do that. The federal courts have no jurisdiction over that, which is an argument the government raised and raised both in the district court. The Court of Appeals, which you think would have some sense, refused to put a stay on that order, sat on it. It was filed relatively early in the day yesterday with a midnight deadline. Court of Appeals took, I think, 6 or 7 or 8 hours to tell them your appeal is not allowed, that there's no jurisdiction. You should have appealed the original TRO, not when the judge set the midnight deadline. Well, that's very interesting because just a week earlier, when the federal government tried to appeal a TRO, the Court of Appeals said you can't appeal the TRO. So in 1 week, they're telling the government you can't appeal from a TRO. In another week, they're telling the government you should have appealed from the TRO. Does not instill faith in the Court of Appeals. And they took that to the Supreme Court. And at 10 o'clock last night, Justice Roberts issued a stay of the district court order. And I think that's very important because I've been arguing on this podcast since day one that the district courts are going too far out of their own jurisdiction. They don't get to run the executive department, their executive branch. There's a separation of powers. And that what these judges were doing, and I think the first time we talked about it was the 1 a.m. on a Saturday morning emergency TRO, which by its own terms prevented any senior leadership in the Treasury Department from reviewing or looking at Treasury Department payment records. Okay, that was scaled back by another judge. But the point is, the judges, unfortunately, are giving the impression, again, not all the judges, some have been even keeled, but many of the judges have given the impression they're an advocate in opposing DOGE and opposing the Trump administration. And I said, in our first time we discussed it, and this was now probably 3 weeks ago, the Supreme Court better get involved, and it better get involved soon, because the judges need to understand it's one thing to rule on the legality. It's another thing to take control of the executive branch. And I think what Justice Roberts was signaling last night. Well, he didn't write an opinion when he granted the stay. Normally, you don't. But I think what he's signaling is, wait a second, we're out of control here. If the Supreme Court doesn't step in, there's going to be major problems, because he is very much an institutionalist. He believes very firmly in the judiciary, and he understands very well that while the judiciary can certainly give unpopular opinions, and his court has done that multiple times, uh, it's one thing to give unpopular opinions. It's another thing to destroy your own credibility. It's another thing to cause the population to completely lose faith in the judicial system. And I hope the justices are understanding that what has been going on the last month in the federal district courts, part of a pre-planned lawfare campaign by the Democrats. It was written about by the New York Times last November, that after the election, they gathered 800 lawyers and 40 plus institutions that were going to challenge every single thing the executive branch did. And I think the Supreme Court needs to understand that if it's going to let the district courts be played this way, and if it's going to allow district court judges to become participants in that plan to freeze the executive department, that there's going to be a complete collapse in popular support for the judiciary. And I don't think John Roberts wants to see that. He understands that the credibility of the system is so important. And so that's why I think they get involved. And I think they're going to have to continue to get involved. There's another case that's before them also, where they didn't issue a stay. That's on their order by a different district court judge, that the Trump administration could not fire a senior official. I forget what department he was in. I think special counsel department, not the special counsel like Jack Smith, a different department. And Trump fired him, and a judge ordered him reinstated. They went to the Supreme Court saying, judge has no authority to do that, can't interfere with who we choose to run our executive department. And the Supreme Court didn't issue a stay on that. Said, we'll wait and see. Well, lo and behold, that person, his last name is Dellinger, is acting like he runs the place. So in the last few days, he's been issuing rulings and decisions that the Trump administration opposes, because a federal district court judge refused to allow them to fire him. That will be, I think we'll get another ruling on that from the Supreme Court any day, maybe even today, because the government went back to the Supreme Court and said, look, you told us to wait 4 days. Look what this guy is doing. You're forcing us to have a senior official making policy for the administration that we don't support because of what a federal judge did. So I think the Supreme Court better get a handle on this. The district courts this has not been their finest month, and neither has it been for the courts of appeal, at least not the DC Court of Appeals. It's up to the Supreme Court to salvage the system.
Do you see that as something that you think they will do?
I think the Supreme Court's going to get increasingly involved. Now, they're not going to devote their whole docket to micromanaging the district courts, but when district courts do outrageous things, and two of them have that are now before the Supreme Court, when they step way out of bounds, when they start running the executive branch, and when they start interfering with the ability of the president to be the president, I think the Supreme Court's going to have to get involved. I think they've got to. Otherwise, they're setting up a very bad situation. Unfortunately, you would think the courts of appeal would serve that role. I mean, that's why they're there. But at least in the DC Circuit and in the First Circuit, they've not been willing to play that role. It's going to fall on the Supreme Court.
No, I think that's a great point too, which is really one of the most important functions of the Supreme Court, which is a check on all of the other branches of power and ensuring that distribution of power remains as it should, and that no one piece of it is getting more than what they ought to have. So it's very crazy to watch. I think on some level we knew this was going to happen. I know we've talked about this in previous episodes too, where at least this time around, Trump and his team seem to be prepared for this. They seem to be prepared for the lawfare. They seem to be prepared for the challenges, and knew that certain things, or at least assumed some of the things that they were doing would be challenged ahead of time. And, at least they seem They just seem to be ready for it. They don't seem to be caught off guard like they did in his first term, which is a tremendous difference between one of the many differences between first term Trump so far and second term Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the people defending these things in court for the government is the civil division of the Attorney General's office, of the Department of Justice. And I've got to say, they've done a very good job. Okay. I mean, there is literally an avalanche of lawsuits being brought in the district courts. And at least from what I've read, they've been doing an excellent job. They're getting this in front of the Supreme Court, but it's a daunting challenge. You have the entire legal infrastructure of the country weaponized against the Trump administration. And it's very well organized, very well funded. They have to be spending weekly tens of millions of dollars, at least a month, on this. It's highly funded, highly organized. It's anti democratic with a small d. They're attempting to overturn the election by uh, overwhelming the court system with challenges to everything the administration does. And this is very reminiscent, although it's worse this time, of his first term, because all they need to do is win once with a district court judge. Okay? There have been other district court judges who have rejected the sort of relief they've been seeking, have refused to step over the line, and good for them. They've done a good job. But they don't need to win all of them. They just need to, of the 40 or 50 or 60 restraining orders they've sought, they don't need to win all of them. They only need to win a handful to completely disrupt the administration. And that's what we saw. I remember early in Trump term number one, when he issued his immigration order, which was falsely characterized as the Muslim ban when it
Right.
wasn't. Uh, there were multiple cases brought around the country. And I remember federal district court in Massachusetts rejected the motion for an injunction challenging that executive order or that program. But another judge, I believe it was in Hawaii, granted it. So the Democrats on these challenges don't need to win them all. They only need to win some of them in order to create enormous disruption. The Trump administration needs to win them all. And that's the problem. When you've got 40, 50, 60 lawsuits being filed, the Trump administration basically has to win them all, whereas the challengers only need to win some of them to obtain their objectives. So this is exactly like the first Trump term.
Well, and I think one of the things we have to remember here when we're looking at these court battles and we're looking at this litigation and these kinds of litigation too, is this is actually a battle on a much broader scale because, and we've talked about this some, but the administrative bloat, the governing through bureaucracy, we have all of these unelected bureaucrats, like literally unelected, at least in the case. There's been substantial criticism about Musk, and we'll talk about that shortly. But he literally campaigned with Trump and went to how many dozens of rallies where he's on stage, and Trump's like, he's going to come with me and he's going to take control of this. And all the people are like, yes, we want this. So this was not a surprise. But that's not the case with the things that the Democrats are challenging now. We have an entire subset of our government that no one votes for. They don't, they're not beholden to legislative action or legislative policy or electoral results. They can essentially void the effects of an election by the way they govern through their own bureaucracies. They can ignore the will of the people over and over again, and they've done it for decades. And so that's what's at stake here. It's actual, and Trump talks about this a lot, and I think people hear it, but I don't think it's always fully internalized. When he talks about giving the country back to the people, this is what he means: rooting out the people who are making decisions that are not held accountable by the people who are voting and by the people who are funding their jobs and paying into the system. And so this is a much bigger battle. It's not just about stopping Trump. It's about the ability to keep pushing all of these things in a way that's outside of any kind of accountability, electoral process. And it's part of why it's so important and so crucial to what happens to our country moving forward. And just as something that irritates me in a soapbox that I like I just can't let go of. We are not a democracy. And if I hear another person say that, like, we are not a democracy. We were created as a democratic republic, which is vastly different from a pure democracy for many reasons. Go back and read our founding documents, read the Federalist Papers, read the discussion, read the debate on why our country was set up the way it's set up. So you have the people on, the other side of the spectrum here, mostly Democrats and progressives, complaining about the democracy and the state of democracy and all this kind of stuff, when they're literally the ones advocating in our court system at every single level to maintain a system that does not allow for democratic decision making. So that's just something that annoys me, and I just had to throw that
Thank
in there. It
thank
drives
you
me up
for
the
that
wall.
TED talk.
Yeah. Exactly. It just drives me crazy. So anyway, to move on a little bit to this Musk situation, and you have to, you can always count on Democrats anytime there's someone on the right who's doing anything or even asking a question. Like, let's go as far back as Joe the plumber, who had the nerve of, asking an unscripted question of Obama that caught him flat-footed, and they go and dox the guy, right? And then he becomes like a folk hero in the aftermath of that. They're doing the same thing to Musk. They're doing the same thing to the Doge team. All these kids who are just like computer nerds who are sitting around, going through coding and finding all this stuff. And the New York Times doxes them. Like the New York Times, which is supposed to be, the penultimate bastion of journalism, and they're the ones doxing these kids and putting their information out there for everyone, and it's just insanely irresponsible. I mean, I know we've talked about this a lot and how dangerous this kind of stuff can be. What are your thoughts on that, and what what are the ramifications of doing something like that?
Well, they are doing to Musk what they did to Kavanaugh and what they've done to Republicans or people who are supporting Republicans. I'm not sure if Musk is even Republican. So many times, complete demonization. There is no question that the left and the Democrats are trying to incite violence. You can't look at the New York Times, where they outed 25 or so staffers who are helping in this effort and put their pictures in the paper. They know what's going to happen. It's the same thing that happened to Kavanaugh. Somebody's going to show up on their doorstep. So I think, and they're inciting people, and I see it on Facebook all the time. A lot of people, liberals, are buying into this, that Musk is a threat to our country. He's going to steal your credit card information. I mean, all this crazy stuff, and people believe it. And there is no question that they are trying to work people into a complete frenzy. So someone takes a shot at him, or someone, like they did with Kavanaugh, where the guy shows up on his doorstep with a loaded gun, but fortunately there was protection there. The Marshal Service was there, or like how they incited people about Trump. I mean, just a complete demonization campaign. And why is it that they're going after Musk? Because they're afraid he'll be effective. They're afraid he will cut off the almost endless supply of government money to the Democrat machine and to the left wing so called non governmental organization machine. We talked about this before. One of the most impactful things Trump has done is cutting off the flow of those dollars. They are absolutely apoplectic. And that's what that USAID lawsuit is all about, that just got ruled on in a temporary stay by the Chief Justice. It's about cutting off the flow of funding to these groups, because a lot of the stuff is very suspicious. There was highlighted by somebody a group that got $17 million and did almost nothing. There was a report that a group related to Stacey Abrams somehow, which had no real operating history, was slated to get a lot of money. The Democrats are apoplectic because they're afraid Musk might be effective in cutting off the flow of money to groups who are essentially pilfering the US Treasury for political purposes. And that's
Yeah.
what the lawsuits are really about. They are very worried that their entire complex of organizations and so-called non-governmental organizations and activist groups, that the money's going to stop flowing. And they're going to do anything they can to stop that. They're going to go to court 50 times. They're going to incite people against Musk. They're going to dox people in the New York Times. This is the vigor with which they are fighting this is a good sign about the impact it will have if the government can cut off the supply of money for meaningless, worthless, political oriented programs on which the left thrives.
I completely agree. I mean, I know that we've talked about this before too. It's just a massive slush fund, and I think, and at least in my mind, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who thought this, most of the money was coming from mega donors. It was coming from the George Soroses. I figured there was a little bit of behind the scenes wheeling and dealing. And of course, if you just look at congressional salaries and net worth, how these people show up and they have nothing and they make less than $200,000 a year. And then a couple years later, a net worth of like 20 million. Like, how is that happening? Right. I did not think it was coming from our money. I didn't think that it was being laundered to that extent. And now we know it is. So we're dealing with much in the same, like what we just discussed with changing the entire system of governance in this country and how that's really the legal battle there, from an unelected bureaucracy to something that's more representative and as it was intended, that this is the exact same kind of thing. I mean, we're cutting off an entire, or Musk is working to cut off an entire ecosystem of people, an entire ecosystem of people that are just pilfering tax money. And the thing is, it's not just these people, it's not just Stacey Abrams that's getting the money. It's all the people that work for her organization. It's all the wheeling and dealing and foreign favors and paying people off all over the world. And it's all with our tax dollars. And so I think he's obviously effective. He's obviously getting very close. Um, to the root of many things, and that's why we're seeing such wild and dramatic outcries from the left, from progressives, from Democrats about what he's doing. And they started this as soon as Doge started, you know, looking into USAID. They were doxing some of the kids who were part of this. And now we have, what was it, 25 people or something like that the New York Times docs. This is not like some online blog of people who found this stuff. This is like one of the largest national publications that did this, and it's incredibly concerning. And this is the time though where, regardless of where you are or what you do, it's a time for a steel backbone. You can't give up and let the bullies win. We don't have another chance at this. I don't believe. It's really now or never for this country and for the future of this country. I think the stakes are truly that high. Um, so, I mean, I hate to see this for these people, but at the same time, it's kind of to be expected. It's just part of their playbook. It's what they do every single time. They demonize, demoralize, and try to destroy people who dare to challenge their corruption, because it's not like they're fighting for anything noble and worthy. They're literally fighting to maintain the ability to launder our tax dollars to line their pockets, the pockets of their family members and friends. And that's just beyond the pale. So anyway, but I'm grateful that they're in there. I'm grateful that they're doing that work. I'm sure we will find all kinds of nastiness as they continue pressing forward. Because, like we talked about before, I mean, really, so far, it's mostly just USAID. We haven't even gotten into the nitty gritty with the Pentagon, the Fed, the IRS. Lord only knows what's happening in those places. So, shifting gears slightly, now that we're talking about the New York Post, there's also been a pretty solid media shakeup. Um, you know, Robert Costas left, where was he? CNN. He got booted off of CNN and started, and it was actually hilarious. When he was kicked off of CNN, started what looked like, you know, a very, very sad little podcast online and was talking about how this is the next era and, all these kinds of things that are just very trite and very sad. And Joy Reid was recently canned. And it's just, then we have Bezos coming out of the Washington Post talking about how the editorial board is now going to be discussing more free market solutions and things, that conservatives like and hold dear. And I mean, honestly, who cares? It's like, just because you allow an opposing point of view on your opinion page a couple of times a week, does that change who you are as a paper? Does that change what your goal is here? Because the New York Times and the Washington Post are notorious for actively trying to destroy people, for running with unsubstantiated reports. The New York Times in particular running as fact a source of a source. Basically, it was just turned into a gossip rag in fancy dressing over the years. Um, and so I don't know. We're definitely seeing a media shakeup on the left. Apparently, whatever they were doing is not selling and is no longer profitable. And at some point, there's only so much money you can pour into enterprises like that before it no longer makes sense. What do you make of some of these changes?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure if it was Bob Costa, Robert Costa, who left. Somebody else. I thought he was at CBS, not CNN, but there were other people at CNN who've been let go. And you're seeing an implosion, really, of the cable television left wing noise machine, which was mostly MSNBC, but also CNN. And maybe their numbers are abysmal. I mean, their numbers are just abysmal. People have tuned them out. They During Trump 1.0, they really rose, grew their ratings because they were the heart of the resistance. But they're not the heart of the resistance anymore. They're Fox News on cable has
Jim
way
Acosta.
more.
I'm sorry. I
Jim
got to cross
Acosta,
the names.
yeah,
Jim
Jim
Acosta.
Acosta, right, as opposed to Robert Costa, Jim
Yes.
Acosta from CNN. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I think that the Democrats are floundering in terms of where their source of noise is going to come from. Now, they still have a tremendous infrastructure. I don't want to get people wrong. All this stuff you're seeing about Doge and the way they're able to push out stupid talking points, 3 days after Trump took office. Why haven't egg prices dropped? You promised us that egg prices would drop. I mean, this is like 3 days after he took office. It's really they still have tremendous influence. We shouldn't kid ourselves. Not as much as they used to. Twitter has given other voices a platform, but they still have tremendous influence. But their influence through MSNBC and CNN, that's not the heart of their influence anymore. I mean, those programs are a joke, basically. That's why they got rid of Joy Reid. She was one of the most horrible people on cable news, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, she would get on there and she would, mock white tears and mock people, make statements that if anybody else said them would be fired immediately, that were very racist. Just a really terrible person. And she survived there up until very recently. Her viewership completely collapsed, and of course now she's out there claiming it's all racist. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's been a sea change. I don't know what platform for the Democrats and for the resistance will replace um, MSNBC, but MSNBC is in a world of hurt right now.
I mean, I think too, they're going to I think they'll pretend to shift more moderate centrist um, to regain some kind of credibility, but it doesn't change who they are. These people believe what they believe. They are who they are. They have to shift accordingly in order to continue to be profitable, but that doesn't mean it really changes anything, you know. Um and again, okay, fine, publish a couple of conservative voices. If you're still a rag that's out to destroy people and push a certain agenda, that's still who you are. And I don't know. I think it's a brave new world. It's also legacy media doesn't have the stranglehold on people that it used to, not even 4 years ago, not with so many younger generations consuming media in different ways. One of the things that I know we kind of struggle with is we still have to have confirmation of certain things by relying on legacy media outlets to confirm certain facts. But the longer this goes on, the less reliable legacy media is on very basic facts, because it's very, very clear that, their agendas, and even with the Associated Press, who's just supposed to be a news wire, and Reuters, who's just supposed to be a news wire, that much of what they do is highly agenda driven. They cover things and omit things in order to portray things in a certain light. And so it's a very, very different mediascape than what we've dealt with in the past. And you know, at least on the progressive side, it looks like that's completely imploding. And I have no idea what that's going to look like. But I do predict that these entities, in order to try and salvage what remains, will at least feign some kind of shift towards the center. Um, but I think we should all keep in mind that that's not real. It's just pretend to help them from going under completely. So, any other thoughts there? I wonder where someone like Joy Reid even goes from MSNBC. Where does anyone from MSNBC go? I mean, what's left for you after departing that ship?
Yeah.
Anyway, but
Yeah, I don't know where she goes. I mean, I guess maybe a podcast, maybe a streaming show. There's really
Substack,
no other outlets for somebody like that.
it's true. Someone who's so lacking in empathy and entitled. Good luck to her.
Yeah.
Um, and then lastly, I know we had talked about this a couple weeks ago, but we did have an online discussion last week where we talked about how DEI is far from dead, and while we greatly applaud the efforts and things and strides that the current administration is taking to cutting these things off, particularly the funding, that the work is still there. It's not going to go away. You can't executive order away DEI, any of this ideology. We will link to that event if you were not able to attend. We'll link to that in our podcast notes. But we're also seeing court cases. There was something, I think, was it a day or two after, and we were kind of joking about how it's really just kind of confirmed the point that we were making. I think it was one of the court cases where one of Trump's executive orders was being challenged. I think it was a funding cut one, or something like that, if I remember correctly.
It was the one challenging diversity, equity, and inclusion, and uh, ordering essentially it be disbanded. And uh, judge in Maryland ruled that it violated, or at least potentially violated, the First Amendment and other rights of various people in the system. And what we're seeing happen is very familiar to those of us who fought against CRT, critical race theory, 2, 3, 4 years ago, which is a
Yes.
definitional thing. Okay. So all of these schools have DEI departments. All of these schools have diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when the government says you can't do that, they say, oh, well, that's not constitutionally vague. What do you mean by DEI? How do we precisely define it? You can't precisely define it. And so that's the game that's getting played, which is you pass, or you issue an executive order addressed to DEI, because DEI is what you're doing and what you're calling it. And then they fight with you saying, well, we don't know exactly what we're not supposed to do because you can't precisely and for all purposes come up with one definition of DEI, and therefore it's unconstitutionally vague. So it's going to be a fight, but that's just a symptom of a deeper problem, which is particularly in education, but not only education, but primarily education, they are not going to give up DEI. I mean, we just had a whole program on this. This is their
Yes.
religion. Okay. This is who they are. This is their self worth is virtue signaling through DEI. And I'm talking about mostly white liberals here, okay, are the most vociferous, that it has become who they are as people. And to have that go away, I think is going to be very difficult. They're not going to give it up. Some of them will change names. I just tweeted about Connecticut College just changed the name of their DEI department, or actually they're opening up a new department in consultation with the DEI people, calling it belonging or something like that, or an inclusiveness. Cornell did the same thing, and I think in the engineering school they renamed the DEI effort. They are not going to give it up. They are not going to give up group identity ideology. They are not going to give it up. And that's a hard fight. The one Trump is at his most powerful when he deals with what happens in his administration and what happens in federal programming. He's at his weakest where it comes to the cultural issue, which is how do you deal with an infrastructure on campuses and in education and in teachers' unions who live for this. I mean, it literally is their entire life is to prove how virtuous they are by uh, acting on negative stereotypes of non-whites, basically. I mean, DEI is basically one massive negative stereotype about non-whites, on which liberals, virtue signal that they're going to try to solve the problem. And so that cultural issue is going to be a problem. Can the administration deal with it and get rid of that cultural problem? Not in 4 years. Now, if we have 4 years of Trump followed by 8 years of Vance, and the money flow is cut off and the career path is cut off, yes, I think there can be tremendous cultural change. But what they're going to do through the lawsuits and all these other things, and through malicious uh, obeyance, I think that's the term, or malicious implementation, they'll pick the most absurd things to do and say, oh, well, Trump forced us to do it. So 4 years is not enough. 4 years can make a difference, but it's not enough. And if a Democrat left wing president comes in, this stuff is going to come roaring back more viciously than it was before. And all the people who've been, just hanging on the university campuses are going to be re-empowered. And so I think that it's an opportunity to start on a path to cultural change, but it's going to take more than 4 years.
I completely agree. And again, I mean, we discussed this for an hour in our program, but it's also so important to remember too on the K through 12 campuses, and we've done research on this about what the incoming teachers are learning, and that they are learning and they are being taught that at a fundamental level, it's part of childhood development, and that these kids are not fully and wholly or rightly formed as people if they're not believing this kind of ideology, if they're not choosing to value and understand people through the lens of race, which is not natural to children. If you have kids, you know that this is not a natural worldview. It's 100% imposed. If you're not teaching them all of these horrible and disgusting things at an early age, then somehow they're not developing properly. And obviously, at least a large portion of the college kids who are being taught this, who go on into elementary and other education and K through 12, believe this because they're practicing it. So this is not something that we can just cut funding to certain federal programs and now the problem's solved, like Bill was just saying. This is so deeply entrenched and so deeply rooted. And if you are right leaning, please, 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 please understand that for us to conquer any kind of ground ideologically, we have to stick with things longer than a news cycle. We have to continue, and that's one of the things I know we do as an organization. I mean, we've been dealing with this for years, back when it really largely fell under the umbrella of cancel culture, but it was the exact same thing, because people who did not adhere to certain principles and ideology were destroyed. And it was really DEI. All of the intersectionality stuff, we've been dealing with that for over a decade. So this is all incredibly important. This is not a battle that's going to go away. It's not won because there's been a couple of legislative actions, either at the federal or state level. I'll say this, and then, I'll leave the rest for y'all to check out on the program. But one of the things we're able to do, especially with our critical race project, because we do now have 4 years of historical data for what higher education has been doing, um, the DEI activities that are happening on campuses all over the country, we're able to track how they're changing, what they're changing, where they're changing, and we're really able to see the gaps between legislative action and the practical application of the legislation and executive action that's happening there. How are these schools responding, if they're responding? And most of them are not, and they won't until they're challenged, probably by organizations like ours. One program at a time. So it's not going away. Be aware of that. Don't say this to be discouraging, but to be realistic about the problem that we're facing, and that it's going to take a very long, concerted effort to root this stuff out. It can be done. It 100% can be done, but it's definitely many, 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 many battles in the war. So, on that note, we thank you for listening. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up for this week. Very busy week for us in other ways. So I know Professor Jacobson has to get back to his professoring. But you can find out more about this episode, everything we discussed, we blog about at legalinsurrection.com. We will post links to the things that we discussed at legalinsurrection.com/24. If you enjoyed this, please like, share, click all the nice buttons. And we appreciate you. We appreciate your time, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.